Hi, everybody. Welcome to Conversations with Calvin, We the Species, on a Thursday night in June. And I've been sitting here chatting with Natalia Molina for a long time because she wrote A Place at the Nayarit, How a Mexican Restaurant Nourished a Community, which I'm reading. I am reading that, and this actually, this interview has been in the works for quite a while. Actually, things, you're in California and I'm in New Jersey. It has nothing to do with the geography, but we were trying. You're busy. I'm not. I'm a card-carrying member of AARP. If I haven't told you, for 2 decades. I mean, so everybody can do the math. That's a lot of decades. But I'm so excited for this because of the synchronicities, because of the background of Natalia. And actually, let me read the title, which is better. The title of the interview, Natalia Molina, professor, actually distinguished professor at USC, actually one of my favorite schools, long story. I'm a refugee guy. In American Studies and Ethnicity. And of course, she's the author of A Place at the Nayarit, How a Mexican Restaurant Nourished a Community. She's also public health, immigration, and she's a MacArthur Fellow in 2020. She can tell us what that is in a bit. And we just have such an interesting journey now. So I've done do you remember Johnny Carson?
Of course.
Well, he was one of my heroes. This was my Johnny Carson monologue without any humor. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Natalia, to do some background, little bio, and then we're going to kind of jump into this marvelous, and I can say it because I've got a whole bunch of notes. I just love taking notes when I'm reading because some of the stuff sticks up here. Anyway, take it away.
Thanks so much for having me, Calvin. It's already been so much fun.
Thank you.
So, as you said, I'm a professor at USC, but I started out in Los Angeles. I'm a third generation Angelino, third generation Echo Parkian, a neighborhood in Echo Park, which is where the book takes place. And I went to my undergraduate at UCLA. I've always been interested in how we think about race. So while I was at UCLA, I was a gender studies major and then added history kind of last minute as I decided to go on to graduate school. But I could have added anthropology or literature. I think the form matters less than what we want to get out of it. And what I wanted to understand is how we make race in America. Went on to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and got my PhD in history there. And then I came back to California and taught in the University of California system in San Diego in ethnic studies and in history, again, in urban studies. So how we think about race, but also how we think about place. And it was really that experience of merging how we think about race and how that shapes place, and how we think about place and how that shapes race, that really led me to write this book. It is a book about my grandmother's restaurant, but it is kind of couched within this larger understanding of race and place.
Wonderful. Wonderful. As sitting here, having plunged into A Place at the Nayarit and feeling, because there's so much feeling there, it just thrills me to be doing this with you. So, as a little bit of an author myself, what compelled you to write this?
I think folks think that, because it's my grandmother's restaurant, it might be the story that I've always wanted to write, but there's two reasons why it actually wasn't. So one, as I mentioned, I went to UCLA, and when I was an undergraduate, 20 years ago, I guess more than 20 years, but I'll just say 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, the understanding was that if you did ethnic studies, Latino studies, African-American studies, that you couldn't really write about your own communities. You were soon seen as biased. And so I was actually in a course at UCLA, a Latin American studies course, where the professor, a white professor, told us, for all you Latinos in this course, you'll never become a Latin Americanist. You wouldn't be objective. And, we filed we did a little protest and did a petition and said that was unfair. But at some level, those messages stick. So I really hadn't thought about writing this book. Fast forward to now having written 2 books as a professor, one about race and place in terms of public health in Los Angeles and how we think about race, and one on how immigration laws shape our ideas about race. And I've also, at the same time, been teaching urban studies for 15 years. And I'm like, you know what? We don't really talk about multiracial, multi-ethnic communities in cities. Just like we do study ethnic studies in silos, Latino studies, African American studies, Asian American studies, indigenous people studies, we don't really see how these groups interact and then how it affects the place. And LA is just one of the quintessential examples of a multiracial, multi-ethnic metropolis. And so we really needed that study. And I know that Echo Park, where I was raised, was such a place. On top of that, Echo Park was changing. It was being gentrified like so many cities across America are. And I thought, now is the time to tell this story. And I've got this great anchor, in fact, what I call an urban anchor, in the story of my grandmother's restaurant. And it was also a way of saying, hey, so many of the histories I see about Latino studies are about labors, about men, about discrimination. Where's the joy? And whereas when people find that in their lives, how do they make place? How do they speak back to that institutional racism? How do they find community? And this restaurant told the story of all those aspects.
Wow. And I'm just gathering up and learning about Echo Park. And we'll get to some of the questions I have, but let's, can we touch a little bit about some of the things you've done, how race is made in America, and fit to be citizens. If you want to, so these are some of the things you did prior to this.
Sure, and I think they both set me up for this book really well. So Fit to be Citizens, Public Health and Race in Los Angeles, you might think, oh, I'm not that interested in public health, or that's more for scientists, but it's actually the opposite. It's actually saying, hey, if you're interested in the story of how race is made in America, or why cities look the way they do, why some are segregated, how they developed, we need to understand the role of public health. And so it was a way of saying, it was a way of looking at the city through an institution, in this case, public health. It could have been immigration, schools, what have you, any other institution. And what's interesting about the story of public health in Los Angeles is that it does shape everything. So that when housing laws, housing funding through the federal government in the 1930s increases, schools get built, all these things, some of the first experts that they go to are public health experts, because they're the ones that have been out in the trenches all this time, so they know about these communities. I started off by looking at Mexican communities. That was the predominant Latino group in Los Angeles in the late 19th, early 20th century. But yet when I was looking at the reports, I would see reports about Chinese, about Japanese, less so about African Americans, because they were a smaller number in the population. And I would kind of put those off to the side, literally in the corner of my desk, like, oh no, that's not what I'm looking at. And one day it dawned on me, wait a minute, why are they developing programs for Mexicans, but not Chinese in the late 19th century, the ones who came and built the railroads and then got pushed out after those things were completed? And why not Japanese, the ones who are farming our crops? And it was a way in which public health can serve as a method of exclusion. Those are unsanitary populations. They can infect your vegetables and don't go to them. And Mexicans, they weren't always programs of exclusion. Sometimes they were programs of inclusion, ways in which they'd say, oh, we need that workforce. We know that you're shutting off immigration towards Jews and people you consider not quite right on Ellis Island through the 1924 Immigration Act, but those leaders, those agricultural leaders, railroad leaders in the Southwest were like, no, we still want our laborers. And so public health officials were like, we can Americanize them, we can sanitize them, we can make sure they're an acceptable workforce. And so that book showed how you have different tracks of race making for different groups depending on what the needs are. Once I started getting into that, it was like, oh, if that affected public health laws, how did it affect immigration laws? And so I went to Washington, D.C., to D.C.'s attic, basically, the National Archives, where we keep all our records. And I looked through walls and walls of boxes and boxes of immigration records.
Wow.
And the thing about those records is they don't say, here's the Mexican records, here's the Chinese records, here's the Japanese records, here's the Jewish records. No, they put them all together. And so you start to see that you're almost like an immigration agent on the border or at Ellis Island or in Angel Island in San Francisco. And you're seeing that they evaluate each immigrant group by the other immigrant groups that came before them. And they evaluate them by how they understand race in America, which within a black and white binary, African Americans and whites. And so it was a way of thinking about race, what I call relationally. How we understand one group is affected by how we understand these other groups. And that led to this notion of racial scripts. If you develop laws, attitudes, and policies for one group, even when their immigration goes down, even when they aren't considered a threat anymore, even if they are, those things can be imposed on the next group. It's a racial script. Mm-hmm. And so those are the kinds of understanding of race as being relational, race as affecting how we think about place that really set me up well for understanding and writing A Place at the Nayarit.
Can you do a synopsis of just a little bit of a synopsis of this?
Oh, absolutely. I'm proud to. The book is really looking at how in 1951, Doña Natalia Barraza, who's my grandmother, opened the Nayarit. I'm named after her, clearly. And this was a Mexican restaurant in Los Angeles, in the neighborhood of Echo Park, that multiracial, multi-ethnic, cultural, and geographic crossroads. And this restaurant quickly became a local landmark because movie stars went there, Hollywood stars, but it was also a place where, its core clientele were other Mexicans, including restaurant workers who came from all over the city. What brought them there? Of course, a restaurant has to have great food, and this was fresh, traditionally prepared Mexican food. My grandmother, started what I call an urban anchor, this gathering space where ethnic Mexican workers and customers connected with their patria chica, which translates into their small country. And so the book, A Place at the Nayarit, traces this community that she helped nurture. Because after she immigrated alone from Mexico to LA, she understood what it was like to be alone. She adopted 2 kids, my mom and my uncle. She ran this business, and then she went on to sponsor dozens of other Mexican immigrants. And not only did she want them to come and live in her home, learn English, work in a restaurant, but she really wanted them to really make LA their own. She encouraged them to go out in LA. She encouraged them to, as I said, speak English, learn English. And so she was really encouraging them not just to be placemakers, but place takers. And so this book is the story of these restaurant workers, how they moved from the kitchen and the front of the house across borders, and traces their life over the next couple of decades.
Wonderful.
And it's a book that's really supposed to illuminate the immigrant experience, family, community, LGBT communities, because some of the workers were LGBTQ as well, and what it is like to live up to those pressures of racism and segregation and create a sense of belonging. To me, it's a book for anybody who's ever had a place where they felt like an insider.
Right. It's funny, in my reading, in this, I put on a huge smile because I love Mexican food. But I think it was a food critic who suggested going into Dona's restaurant for the chili with a medicine dropper. That was hysterical. I mean, it was really, it was strong and powerful, but you got to use a medicine dropper. The other thing I gleaned, and I didn't know this, I'm always assuming New York this, New York that, but yeah, I think at one time the LGBTQ community out there might have been the largest in the country, is what I think I read. Some of the societies that was born out of it, and the Manichaean Society and stuff. So it's quite a place, Echo Park, and it's funny. Just the early reading is telling me that when I ever get back to LA, I don't like to go there a lot because I'm always induced to want to live there. I don't want to live there, but I would love to go through Echo Park, because it's got such a rich, really does, such a rich history because of its makeup. It's, I don't know if liberalism is the right word, but anyway, as a writer, I'm always interested in people's methods, how they do something. So did you use any specific methods for Place at Nayarit?
When I went into this book, Calvin, I thought, I got this. I'm now, a full professor. I've written 2 books. I've got the experience. Plus, I'm writing about a city I've already written about. And so I had some oral interviews. I knew I could get that because, the book is based on my family's story. But for any interview you do, you have to really contextualize it, fact check it, cross check it, come up with these histories besides the oral interviews. And so I went to and I needed to contextualize Echo Park because there are no histories written of it, no book length histories anyways. There's a wonderful book by Daniel Hurwitz on Bohemia in LA that looks at it through the LGBTQ lens and the larger area of Echo Park and Silver Lake called Edendale. But so I went to the city archives, I went to the county archives, I went to private archives like at the Huntington Library. And, Echo Park was an area that was overlooked. It didn't have a lot of investment in it. And then these are groups, these Mexican immigrants are groups that don't really leave a lot of archives. I was like, okay, so I did genealogical search records for all those people that use ancestry.com and family search. I did that. Anybody that was mentioned in a record, I would look them up. Any spot that they talked about that they went to, the $1 Million Theater downtown in Los Angeles. I know more about the $1 Million Theater than most people would ever want to know. And yet you can't put all that in the book because the book's not about the $1 Million Theater. You can only let into the book what really fits with the story. But I still wasn't quite getting at these communities in a way that gave them depth and breadth. And then one day it hit me. I remembered my great aunt sitting on her porch in Echo Park reading this newspaper called El Eco, the Nayarit. And it's not a newspaper from LA or California or the US. It's a newspaper from their home state of Nayarit.
Wow, wow.
And it's once I started looking it up, it's like looking at Facebook, right? It's like the Facebook in, the analog edition. They had this column called Redaferis, this Ferris wheel column. And it had all the comings and goings of people that were from Acaponeta, from Nayarit. And it talked about their lives there, but it talked about their lives in the US. People would write in from LA, hey, we're doing this. Hey, I opened a restaurant. In the anniversary edition, people like my grandmother would put advertisements for their restaurant. Wow. So it's this trans-local community. Some people talk about transnationalism. I like thinking about the trans-local. This is a term that scholars have coined, saying like from community members to community members, connecting in these different places. So these trans-local communities, it was a way for people to stay rooted. And it was through that newspaper that then I got the names of so many other people. Wow. Who were able to look up their genealogical records, put ads out on Facebook, anytime I got an interview with someone, I did what we call snowball snaps interviews, where any name they mentioned, I asked for their names. And it was amazing. And then once I started doing interviews, even before the book was published, people would contact me. People that were outside the Mexican community, like Cheryl Melnick in Oregon, who said, we used to live in Echo Park, me and my husband, and we used to go to the Nayarit. And to this day, when we go to a Mexican restaurant, we might say, is it good? And we'll say, it's good, but it's not the Nayarit. Wow. So because it was an urban anchor, community anchor, people have come to me, as well as me, doing everything I can to reach out to everybody that ever crossed through the doors of the Nayarit.
Okay. It's funny, you just said a minute or two ago, you were describing, I don't know, it was Horowitz, he used the term Bohemia. Mm-hmm. And I extracted from your book, Bohemia really is a byproduct of consequence. And I thought that was very profound. I just wanted to mention it. I'm trying to impress you that I actually read this stuff, and and I'm putting it up here. So
impressed.
Well, thank you. You talked a little bit about Echo Park, and maybe someday I'll go there. How and why did your grandmother want to open up a restaurant and settle in Echo Park?
One of the other things I talk in the book is what it's like to write a history of the underdocumented, not undocumented, but underdocumented. So, communities that leave no records, it's not like there's a lot of letter writing and that people are saving their archives to then send into, for example, the new Latino museum that the Smithsonian is going to build. Yes. And in my grandmother's case, she immigrated here on her own and didn't really have a lot of family, or didn't have family around for a long time. And so there aren't even stories to tell about her. And so I don't necessarily have the answer, but what I can do as a historian is contextualize what was going on. So she had started a little restaurant near Alvera Street, and that makes sense because Alvera Street's like this touristy Mexican kind of Disneyland. And there were a lot of office workers that ate at that restaurant. So I could see why she set up there. But then when the lease on that was closing, she could have easily just, gone out to Sunset Boulevard right there outside her door and looked east, and then gone 2 miles east and settled in East Los Angeles. She would have been around other Spanish speakers. She would have, been able to conduct business more easily. Instead, she went 2 miles west into Echo Park. More of a challenge because it had a very low Latino population at that time, unlike today. But she also wasn't she was a non-traditional person. She was a single woman. She had adopted 2 kids. She was divorced. So I think one of the things was she might have gone because she would have been surrounded by other non-traditional people, those Bohemians, those people that also had different family structures, the LGBTQ community, but also still other immigrants. If you look at the demographics at that point, Echo Park is very diverse, or it may not seem diverse. It's very white. But if you look at the census data by white, they're white immigrants. They're Jewish, they're Italian, they're Greek, they're Hungarian, they're French, they're Irish, and they're starting their own businesses. So many of the businesses in Echo Park were started by immigrants like herself. Amy Semple McPherson has her Angela Temple there that also draws in people. So it's that kind of place. And of course, the rents were cheap. So that's also going to attract a small business owner like her.
It's funny, as her business grew, Joseph next door had a furniture store, so she took that over and increased the size, and she changed it around. And I really, it was just so fascinating. By the way, she was an amazing woman. Really. I want to say way ahead of her time, but really way ahead of her time. The food at the Nayarit was so different and so unique. How and why was it? And people, talk about it from Oregon or whatever. What distinguishes
Part of it is that, for Mexican food, a lot of it, we don't want it to be distinguishable, right? We have a certain idea of like, it's a taco enchilada plate and with that yellow cheese on, melted on there and those refried beans. And, she had some of that on her menu for sure. She also made really delicious fresh flour tortillas made by hand. However, those weren't from her region. Her region embraces the corn tortilla. Flour tortillas are more northern Mexico. So she did try to cater to a wide clientele. That being said, she did her best to provide food from her state of Nayarit. So the state of Nayarit is a coastal town. And so, it's known for its shrimp and its fish. And she would have that on the menu, fish cooked, whole fish that would be reminiscent as if you went to the beach in Nayarit and you were under one of these little huts, open air huts, and they brought you the whole fish. Fish or shrimp that she could put in tamales and empanadas and tacos and everything. Those supplies were a little bit limited in Los Angeles at that time period. So some of that wasn't always on the menu. There were more specials, but she would make the sauces like they made in Nayarit. Nayarit's known for its gorditas, these beautiful corn masa pockets, fried, that you stuff with, the protein and the veggies and the nice soft cotija cheese. And then you bathe it in this tomato sauce, really light, like just a tomato broth, chicken broth, tomato, these little dents of garlic that you what's the word in it? Lo mueles, that you blend.
Okay.
But the gorditas were harder to make and produce at that level for the restaurant. So she would make tacos, but she would use that tomato bath. And even to this day, when I go to a place and they have that tomato bath, it's almost like my antennae go up and I'm just like, you're from Nayarit. And they're like, how do you know? I'm like, the tomato broth.
That's funny. One off-topic question. I always like to ask this. I kind of think I know the answer. But anyway, I'll ask it anyway. And you don't even have to answer. So here's the setup. Excluding family or friends, somebody you'd like to spend the day with, living or dead.
That's a great question.
It is. It is.
I think that's a hard question, but I think one of the first people that pops to mind is Michelle Obama. I think Michelle Obama, not just because, of the life she's lived, but as someone who's just written a book about my grandmother and how you present information, I think she's a really strong person and that she must keep so many opinions to herself. I read her autobiography and it's a well-told story and a beautiful story and an inspirational story, but I think it's one that she writes to kind of appeal to the masses.
Yeah.
I've also listened to her podcast on Spotify, and there's this one episode that's wonderful where she's talking to her girlfriends, and you could tell there's a lot of conversations they're having behind closed doors, and there's one episode with Barack Obama where they just have a certain ease that you could tell they actually have to pull it back. And so I would love to spend the day with her if it were behind closed doors. I would sign any non-disclosure agreement just to kind of know how she naturally was, and to then ask her the kinds of things in her book that when I read, I think, I know there's a lot she's not saying there.
Of course. Great answer. Great answer. Somebody the other day, I forgot who it was. We were on actually a California. He said that she would make a great candidate coming up for big office, and I kind of scratched my head. I said, that's kind of interesting. It really is an interesting thought. Okay, back to business. So in a world that seeks to make Mexican immigrants invisible, Nayarit was a place that highlighted visibility. Can you talk about that?
I think we forget how hard that life could be when there was sanctioned segregation, ways in which there were such ways in boxing people into their lives. So let's think about all aspects of our lives: where we live, where we go to school, where we can send our kids to school, where we worship, where we work, where we can eat, play, recreate, worship. All those things were subject to segregation. And I think people think of segregation as, wait, are you talking about California? I thought segregation was more relegated to the South, to African Americans. That kind of segregation, we often think of, it's called Jim Crow segregation. And for the Southwest,
Jaime Crow,
Juan Crow, Jaime Crow, that these things also apply to these groups. Some of these were sanctioned segregation, and you could look at, or you could put in your show notes that sign, that they would have in Texas: no dogs, no Mexicans, no Negroes allowed. Or you could look at the laws that we had in the Southwest. One of the biggest cases before the Brown v. Board education case that struck down segregation was in California, a California state case, Mendez versus Westminster, that said that Mexicans could not legally be segregated from attending schools. So it's within that atmosphere. I say all that to say, within that atmosphere, it meant so much then that you could go to a restaurant, be waited on in Spanish, order the foods that you wanted, speak in Spanish, sing in Spanish, be loud in Spanish, that you could make the sign of the cross before you ate your meal, maybe say a little prayer. All these things that people did. And we're not just talking about first generation disenfranchised Mexican workers that are, coming from their bricklayer job. We're also talking about famous people, baseball players. Echo Park is, Dodger Stadium sits in its backyard. And so in the 60s, there weren't a lot of Latino players on the Dodgers, but the visiting teams had them, and they were often dark skinned. They presented as Black. And so it was hard for them when they went out to a restaurant and they wanted to be at ease, be at home. And so they would go to the Nayarit. The famous Hall of Fame baseball announcer, Jaime Jarin, Vin Scully we think of, but Jaime Jarin is the Spanish broadcaster, has won every award for broadcasting. He was one of the regulars at the Nayarit. And I asked him, here's Jaime Jarin, who could go anywhere. Charming person. And, just could move with ease all over. And I'd say, why? I asked him, why did you go to the Nayarit? And he said, it's where I knew I could find people that I knew. I would bump into folks. I could feel comfortable there. So, everybody from your average worker to these big personalities felt comfortable somewhere where they knew that they were not going to be discriminated against.
Okay. The workers. I love the terms you use. They were not just placemakers, they were place takers. So how did the workers in Dona, hired these people and gave them, wonderful, how did they navigate the segregation in Los Angeles that they encountered?
So one of the things that my grandmother asked was that people learn to speak English, that they take some English classes. And this varied, and it wasn't like a hard and fast rule. So the younger people came to the US, the easier it was for them. And so especially her relatives, they were able to even enroll in high school or go to ESL classes. Some of the workers didn't, and especially if they weren't workers that she sponsored. One of them, Lupe Reyes, I asked her, how did you communicate with your diverse clientele when you never learned to speak English? And she said, I didn't speak English, but I spoke food. So the other thing you saw was that they met, customers there, formed friendships, And then were then incentivized to go out to other parts of Los Angeles. One of my favorite examples of this is the LGBTQ community. Many of the waiters there were gay. And so while some of the employees might go to, the Palladium and might go dancing, every once in a while, the gay employees really had to go to different parts of Los Angeles. Some might be downtown LA to the working class gay bars, but some of them went to, Santa Monica, to the beaches. Some of them went to, different spots over there. And so I just recently, I bumped into a friend of mine who was with somebody who just did a documentary on gay LA. And she said, oh, Natalia wrote this book, and she also writes about the gay workers. And he said, and I said, the gay workers were some of the ones that were most likely to go out in LA. And he said, yeah, because we only have what we make. We have to create these communities. So there's a real politics to that kind of place taking that the workers were involved in.
Interesting. So ultimately, who'd you write this book for? You, your family, or the public?
For me, when I started it, I still had a little bit of that internalized message of, you can't write about your family. So it was hard to write at first. So I looked at different styles to write the book in: memoirs, food histories. There's so many good food histories out there, family stories. And so for me, it was initially looking at how Echo Park was changing with the gentrification and wanting those folks to know that there was a history there before, and that it could be told through institutions like restaurants, that they didn't have to be formal institutions. It was meant to be an addition to, when we study cities, that we can also look at multi-ethnic, multiracial places and how they shape place. But as the story progressed, and as I did more interviews, and as people also told me that the restaurant was so meaningful to me, it was also a way to say, I want everybody to be able to write about their own urban anchor. And especially for school kids that have to write California history, and much of that those California history projects are still told kind of from the top down, or you have to do a model of a mission, a Spanish mission, to understand California history. I'm like, I want people to understand and connect to their California history through their neighborhood urban anchor, and couch it within the history of their neighborhood. They'll understand Spanish colonialism. They'll understand all these other periods in history if they trace it back through something they know. So along with the book, I've been working on a K-12 curriculum to help make that happen. Okay,
wow. Did writing this book, did you ever have a relationship with, quote, Echo Park? And I can't even imagine how it had evolved over the years. But did it change how you view Echo Park? I mean, I'm an Easterner, so Echo Park I'd never heard of until, although there's a park here in New Jersey called Echo Park, and I wonder if it's, anyway, did it change how you view that particular section?
For me, Echo Park is the story of so many neighborhoods. It's a story of Brooklyn that's changing. In Los Angeles, Boyle Heights, Highland Park, but Seattle, Portland, Austin, and it's only increased so with the pandemic, right? As people have been able to move and live in cities that they hadn't especially thought of. Even in our desert, Joshua Tree is now one of these changing places. Yeah. So for me, it's more a story of, I don't think when many people move into a neighborhood, they're intentionally trying to displace people as it gentrifies. Nonetheless, that's what happens, and so it's a story of what happens if we think about neighborhoods changing as something that we think of not only as an individual, but as a community. how can we bring a civic mindedness lens to these experiences? If we're attracted to a neighborhood because of its cultural authenticity, what does it mean that as we move into that neighborhood, it might change, and that the longtime residents and businesses might need to move out? Are there things structurally that we might change then? Mm-hmm. Might we implement things like, a cap on rent? That if we put a building in, there's a certain amount of mixed use housing that we need to include. What are the kinds of things that we can do? And we may not all agree, but it's worth having a conversation if we appreciate the neighborhoods that we're moving into.
So interesting. You talk about neighborhoods. When my wife grew up in Brooklyn, and there are trees in Brooklyn. A lot of people don't think that, but there are trees in Brooklyn. But she grew up in Brooklyn, and in the section Williamsburg was a section, and I marvel at this. It completely regentrified to the point where my son and daughter-in-law lived in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, but it had changed so much that the rents, it became this mecca for anybody under 30, under 40. And in the span of just, a handful of years, and just the study of urban, it just happened so fast. And in many ways, Williamsburg passed Manhattan by, rents $4,000 for one room. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And it was this mecca for young people. I always marveled at that. And I'd gone to this lecture, and it kind of makes me think of the Nayarit. I'd gone to this lecture, an urban, I think it was from Columbia, Kenneth, I think it's Kenneth, it was years ago, but he used this as a gauge of how a section is going to come back to life in the city. And I've always thought about this. He said, the more sidewalk cafes you see, it's coming back to life. Your comment on the world losing places like the Nayarit, it's happening, and the world shouldn't lose places like that, should it?
To be able to go into a place where you feel welcome and you don't have to, especially if you move to a place, right? What makes us feel comfortable? Where we go in a public space. And, we think of public spaces like parks, for example, but for most of us, it's where can we go and be a regular and feel that everyone has access to that same space? That's what makes the difference.
It's funny, along those same lines, there's a place in New Brunswick on campus, and it's called Olive Branch. And I discovered it in 2005, 2006, and that's the only place I go to.
Yes.
It's the only place that's like Nayarit. It's the only place I go to. Yes, there must be 40 restaurants in New Brunswick, but that's the only place I want to go to because I'm just comfortable there, and there's this sense of community. But so I'm thinking, as we kind of wind down, as you're doing all this massive research and putting all this together, and it's massive. I can't even. Did any kind of stories like surprise you about all of this and the stories you tell?
I think that when you think, oh, someone's doing an oral history, so those are the stories that are of the underdocumented, you're finally going to get all the juicy parts, right? Just like a source might not tell us everything, a newspaper source, a photo, any kind of source you can think of, even an oral interview is not going to tell you everything. There are things people don't want to talk about. There are things that they don't want to talk about to you, but they don't want to even talk about in their own lives. And so it was, running against these silences. And I'll give you an example. I took my mom out to eat one day, and she introduced me to one of the hostesses at the restaurant. And after she left, I said, you introduced her as one of the former workers at the Nayarit as his daughter. My mom says, yes. And you said he was married and he had 6 kids or something. Yes. Well, everybody else in my other interviews told me that he was gay. Yes. Well, how was he gay and he had this family? Well, he was one way at work and one way at home. And it wasn't so much that she didn't want to talk about it. It was just, this is how they kind of accepted things and or didn't question them. So, those kinds of things were very interesting to me. Just because you have an oral interview and you have someone there that you can ask whatever you want, doesn't mean they're going to tell you whatever you want.
Right. Exactly. It's funny. I did an interview a couple of years ago with a veteran of DDay.
Oh.
And he was on the USS Arkansas, and it was a small ship from World War One, so their guns were even smaller. And their job was just to shell the German installations of D-Day. He was 100 years old, and he had never. And I'm not special. I'm 6'5". You can't tell, but I'm tall, not intimidating. I'm gently tall. But he never talked about that, the shelling of the beaches at Normandy. And we were just talking, and we were talking about his life and this and that. And I gently, and I was forewarned, he won't talk about it, but he did. And he did, and he opened up. And I was so thrilled. They did so well. Their job was to shell and then abandon ship and just let the ship rot in the water. But they did so well that they were asked to go to the Pacific, and so they sailed around and they went to the Pacific and fought there. But the point being, you never know when somebody's going to say something and open up and not open up. So, Natalia, by the way, I had a million other questions, but for another time and another place. Just the last. So what do you do now? Where do you go now? I know it's funny when I finished writing my second novel. It's like, what do you do? So do you have anything in mind, or what direction you want to go in now?
I go where the wind takes me there, Calvin. Okay. So while I was writing this book, I got asked to consult on an exhibit for the Huntington Library, Museum, Arts, and Gardens here in Pasadena. And there was this little, we looked at all the artifacts that they had, all the archival materials, and one was a ledger of their Mexican workers. Oh, wow. All it had was their last names and an initial and their wage. One sheet. Wow. And that is the one sheet that launched the new project that I'm working on, which is really looking at what does it mean to tell the story of a famous place, of a famous man, Henry Huntington, but through the eyes of his workers. Wow.
Wow. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that the place that's in the Rose Bowl parade?
For their 100th anniversary, they did a float.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I thought I saw that. Wow. What a great twist. That's just great. This has been wonderful, and really, and I was looking forward to it. I know why I was looking forward to it, because I could sit and listen to you all night, the stories, and because I relate to so much of that in my own world, small way. But Natalia, I can't thank you enough, and I got to thank Nanda. Helps coordinating all this. She's been great, and please do come back whenever. I sit in this chair 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. So would love for you to come back at some point.
I really appreciate it. I had a great time. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. So in the words of a Californian, Clint Eastwood, in one of his movies, you made my day. So thank you so much, Natalia.
Thanks so much, Calvin.
You be well.